Today we're going to show you storms number 20 to 11. The final 10 will be out tomorrow. At number 20, we follow Rita's rampage through the Gulf of Mexico, beginning as a tropical storm over the Turks and Caicos Islands, passing between Florida and Cuba, passing just south of the Keys as a Cat 1 coming on 2, and becoming a Cat 5 in the central Gulf of Mexico before approaching Texas and sparking the largest evacuation from a cyclone in history. The storm moved towards the north after landfall as a Cat 3 in Texas, and caused significant amounts of damage, as we all know. Back in the remarkable 2005 hurricane season, peaked with winds of 180 miles an hour, sub 900, 895 in the end, the second strongest of 2005. The strongest landfall, 115 miles an hour, $12 billion of damages as a result of the storm, 14.4 if it happened today, 125 fatalities, and over 4 million evacuees from the storm. Obviously pretty wary after Katrina. Here's plenty of images of Rita at and after its peak. A beautiful storm it was, and here's a nice little image from what it looked like before it reached the peak. I think this was just when its intensification was starting, that 3D graphic. And here's some pictures from from one of the recon flights in the eye of Rita. Fantastic images from them as well, who do a fantastic job flying into these storms day in, day out. Here's the radar imagery showing Rita's landfall right on the border between Texas and Louisiana, and then moved into Texas after its landfall affected both of those states pretty badly. And the largest evacuation in US history resulted from this storm, and that was a tragedy in itself, with around 100 people dying as a result of the evacuation due to the heat wave that was occurring in Texas at the time. And here's the start of the succession of damage photos that resulted from the storm, mainly in Texas and Louisiana, where the storm struck. A Category 3 landfall, just like Katrina, could have been worse, but even so, it was still pretty damn bad. Look at it. Most of the rainfall fell in Louisiana, peaking at over 15 inches, 16 inches actually, in a place called Bunkie in Louisiana. The wind damage mainly occurred along that border between Louisiana and Texas, of course. Some buildings were damaged. You can see there lots of flooding occurring. That's mainly for Louisiana, but some places in Texas received 10 inches of rain as well. Even in further inland states such as Arkansas receiving 5 inches, as well as Mississippi and Alabama receiving around 6 inches each. In some places, of course, those are the maximums. Some places received less. One 120 fatalities resulted from the storm, all of those in the US, 113 of those in Texas. The others, 4 in Mississippi, 1 in Louisiana, 2 in Florida, and it could have been worse.
Hurricane Camille at one point in history was considered to be the strongest Atlantic hurricane landfall on record at 190 miles an hour. This has since been revised down to 175. However, Camille is known as one of the worst storms, if not the worst storm, to affect the Mississippi coast, as storm surges from the storm was actually very comparable to Hurricane Katrina. At the time, this storm was the costliest hurricane to ever hit the United States. One of the things that I remember about this system is when I was panning through videos of it, of one survivor's account where they were all having a party in a house, and the storm ended up coming along shore and bringing over 150 mile per hour winds. So they ended up all going to the basement, and they said the water ended up coming almost only 2 feet away from actually getting into the house. And the damage to the house was very similar to what you would expect from an F3, F4 tornado. And also the rainfall from the storm was extremely intense. And anybody that went outside, you could not stand up at all. Not to mention there was flying debris all over the place.
At the time, Camille was the second costliest storm ever in the Atlantic, behind Betsy just 4 years earlier. It did match its cost, though it is in $1969, meaning that inflation adjustment is probably slightly less than what it was for Betsy. The total amount of damage, $1.42 million in 1969. That translates to over $9 billion today, and over 250 people lost their lives as a result of this storm's far-reaching effects.
Hurricane David is one of the few Category 5 storms known to make landfall at peak intensity near a very large population center, as Hurricane David made landfall as a 175-mile-per-hour Category 5 hurricane in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. Surprisingly, although it crossed Hispaniola, the storm actually did not cause that many deaths in Haiti, which is absolutely shocking. This storm would end up maintaining hurricane strength as it moved parallel to the coast of Florida and would make an unusual landfall near Savannah, Georgia, which has not seen a hurricane since 1893. David's death toll and damages were unprecedented in the Dominican. Elsewhere, however, the damages were rather light. David is responsible for over 2,000 deaths, most of them coming in the Dominican Republic.
Add to that $1.54 billion of damages along its extensive track, resulting in over $5 billion if it was today. There's a picture of its landfall, and there's a picture of David around its peak intensity when it was a Category 5. There's another picture there when the storm was passing Florida, and these are possibly some better images where you can see the storm with more clarity along. It hugged that Florida coastline before making its final landfall over in Georgia. Now at number 17, onto Hurricane Beulah, which formed in September 1967 and entered the Caribbean, rapidly intensifying to become a strong Category 4 before getting too close for comfort to the Dominican Republic and weakening to a Cat 1 and then a tropical storm as the land interaction got the better of it. Then it dodged Jamaica to the south by the looks of things and then moved towards the northwest as a Category 3, weakened slightly before another landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula, and then made its final run for the Gulf Coast and reached its peak intensity of a Cat 5 before making landfall just on the border between Mexico and Texas at that Cat 5 intensity. Massive landfall, though it could have been in a worse place. Its peak intensity was 160 miles an hour, its minimum air pressure 923 millibars. Beulah caused misery all across the Caribbean Sea and beyond. 4 landfalls in the end, 155 miles an hour was the strongest one, so it weakened just a little bit before that final landfall. $1 billion of damages at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's $7.08 billion in today's money. 688 fatalities resulting from the storm as well, all across the Caribbean there.
Hurricane Ivan was an extremely powerful Category 5 hurricane that existed very well to the south in the Atlantic Basin, becoming a major hurricane at beneath 10 degrees north and ended up becoming a Category 5 at only 10.2 north. As the storm moved north and west away from South America and started to interact with the Lesser Antilles, the storm ended up exploding in both size and intensity, and while it moved west of Cuba, the storm achieved over 50 points on my CDPS scale, which is quite remarkable to say the least. The storm would end up becoming probably the worst storm on record for the Florida Panhandle and Alabama, as it made landfall in Gulf Shores. The storm, although not exactly directed to that many deaths, less than 150, the storm is responsible for over $20 billion in damages.
Interesting facts associated with this storm. Ranks number 10 for the most intense storm in the Atlantic, and ranked number 6 for the costliest storm in the Atlantic. And Storm's track took it it was a very interesting track actually, and some major landfalls or close passes to land.
One of very few Atlantic storms to reach Category 5 intensity on 3 separate occasions. There it is again, and this is an image from one of the Hurricane Hunter flights inside the eye. And now let's take a look at some of the damage photos. I think that's in Grenada, and now we're looking at what the flooding looked like in the US and the damage to homes along the Florida coast there. Hurricane Ivan, number 16 on Hurricane Week 2015, covering the top 100 Category 5 storms. Only 15 more to go. And now to 2006 and Typhoon Bopha. You may have heard that name once already, and that's because we're covering 2 of them on this Hurricane Week. This one from 2006 in the West Pacific, which threatened the Japanese islands, becoming a Category 5 near those islands, and then striking China as a Category 4. It looked very impressive up until that landfall as well. A big landfall with wind speeds of 130 miles an hour there. Passing through those Japanese islands too as a Cat 5 with peak wind speeds of 160 miles an hour, some low air pressure of 925 millibars. What did it do? Just the one landfall, of course. $2.5 billion of damages in the end, 458 fatalities, and 1.17 million evacuees as a result of the storm as well, one of the highest ever in the Western Pacific. I'm sure most of us still remember this storm, Typhoon Bopha, which formed in 2012 in the Western Pacific and came out of nowhere. I certainly remember tracking it. A tropical storm, very low latitude, became Category 5 at a ridiculously low latitude as well, near Palau. Well, it passed Palau and then became a Category 5 before making landfall in the Philippines. Category 4 passing Palau though, and a Cat 1 landfall on Palawan before re-intensifying. Remarkably, a big surprise that one was. Approaching Luzon, but didn't do any further damage. The damage has already been done in truth, but we'll talk about that in just a quick moment. 175 miles an hour was its peak intensity up until that landfall. It made landfall at that intensity as well. The pressure around 918 millibars, possibly lower. 3 landfalls. Over $1 billion of damages, and nearly 2,000 people lost their lives, pretty much all of them in the Philippines. 2,000 buildings reported damage, though I expect that may have been more, and nearly 200,000 people were evacuated from this monster of a storm. I remember at the time when I was tracking it in 2012 and in the immediate aftermath that it was a big surprise, massive late season storm. Little did anyone know that the same time next year we'd be talking about something that would be hugely bigger than that in the form of Haiyan. Whole areas of Mindanao decimated by this storm. I mean, we talk about Mindanao, and very often we see small storms that pass through there, usually late season, that cause a hell of a lot of damage and loss of life. Imagine what it would have been like going through Bopha in that area. (1989) September, and a major hurricane threat for the Lesser Antilles and for Puerto Rico. But it was going to be more than that had a threat from Hurricane Hugo, because of course it made its ultimate Category 4 landfall on the US East Coast. The storm started out tamely enough, as they often do, but rapidly became a Category 5 storm on approach to the Lesser Antilles, weakened to a Cat 4, but was still over Puerto Rico before it weakened further, and then re-strengthened on approach to the US, making landfall in the East Coast in the Carolinas as a Category 4 and then moving inland. Its peak wind speed 160 miles an hour, lowest pressure 918 millibars once again. In the end, Hugo made 5 landfalls, with its strongest one 140 miles an hour in the US, I believe. $10 billion of damages in the end. Adjusted for inflation, that's $19.1 billion of damages today across the whole of the Atlantic, or parts of it, of course, where it hit. Over 100 fatalities in the end as well, and nearly 100,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, 15,000 of those the latter. Here's some photos of the damage from Hurricane Hugo. A massive disaster in the areas that it hit, particularly around the immediate area around its landfall location when it made its final landfall in the US, but the storm caused a lot of problems. Look at that, by the way, the before and after picture there of a coastal building, and there's a bridge that collapsed, at least partially, and those houses just shunted inland by the storm surge that Hugo brought with it. Now we go on to one of the Western Pacific monsters, and it came in the form of Angela, forming the back of a storm train from Yvette and Zach in front of it. But Angela passed just south of Guam as a tropical storm and then started to develop, though it did stall a little bit before setting course for the Philippines, sandwiched between two other storms, becoming a Category 5 and then making landfall in the Philippines near that peak intensity, a massive landfall there. And then the storm moved on towards Hainan Island, which it passed just to the southwest of before dissipating completely, didn't even make it to Vietnam or China proper. But its peak wind speed 180 miles an hour, its minimum air pressure 910 millibars, probably the strongest storm of 1995, I'm not entirely sure on that one, but certainly one of them. 2 landfalls in the end, its first one 160 miles an hour, over $300 million of damages, and over 1,000 people lost their lives, most of those in the Philippines, a big tragedy there. But the biggest and most shocking fact of them all is that nearly 750,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed by this storm. 225,000 of those destroyed completely. Imagine how many people would have been left homeless after the passage of this storm, Typhoon Angela, and that's why it makes it to number 12 on Hurricane Week this year in 2015, showing the top 100 Category 5 storms.
Hurricane Gilbert from 1988 to 2005 was known as the deepest storm ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. This storm took a similar track to Hurricane Allen only 8 years previous. However, unlike Allen, which did not make landfall anywhere in the Caribbean, Gilbert did not leave the Caribbean so lucky, as it ended up making landfalls in the Leeward Islands, Jamaica, as well as the Yucatan Peninsula, and then also making a major hurricane landfall south of Brownsville, Texas. Gilbert is known for the second most intense landfall anywhere in the Atlantic Basin, as it made landfall with 900 millibars of pressure on the Yucatan Peninsula. The storm is attributed to 318 deaths across the entire Caribbean and Mexico, and is responsible for $7.1 billion in damages. It's also one of the largest storms that I know of.
This monster caused 433 fatalities as well. Just look at its satellite presentation when it was at its peak intensity just to the west of the Cayman Islands. You certainly wouldn't want to mess about with that storm. Here's some of the damage pictures. There is a whole hillside defoliated, all the trees just knocked over by the sheer wind speed of the storm. There's a plane, a light aircraft, that was dragged away and sandwiched between two trees. There's several houses and aircraft hangars that were severely damaged by the storm. It was pandemonium in some locations. There's one airport, I think that might be in Jamaica, I'm not too sure, but damage was severe all over the place, particularly in the Caribbean, as the storm passed. The final part of Hurricane Week 2015 will be broadcast live with your reaction read out straight after the show. Which storm do you think should be number one, and do we agree with you? Find out at 9 PM UTC on Saturday, November 7th.